let's give the word to panelists. So Christoph.
My first question is, it's usually a difference between sociologists and that you are likely to become very soon, and economists. In a way, they measure parental background, right? Would you expect differences in terms of the inequality trends in the UK, depending on whether you focus on income, as economists usually do, or social class, which sociologists mostly do? And I've seen that you cited John Goldthorpe's paper from 2013, and he pointed out that this is of a very high relevance, at least in the UK, because of the measurement problems. For one of the main income data that people tend to use, because the income is usually provided in a snapshot manner, while it's a transitory feature to a larger extent than social class, right? And so that's my first question. And I also have does it still matter actually, because maybe something has changed in terms of the data availability in the UK. And the second one is related to the recent COVID crisis, because I was thinking about the potential consequences for the status inequalities among the universities, because we have seen that some universities are more affected by the outflow of the revenues from the international students than the others. So the Russell Group, they have much more diversified sources of revenues, while red brick universities very much they depend on the headcounts and the money they get through tuition fees. So that would be the second. And sure. What could be the consequences of that process if it's likely to occur for the educational inequalities?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the social class versus income, obviously I'm really familiar with this discussion. I'm probably quite a lot more relaxed about it in this context, because there's only really one data point that would be affected by this at all, because all the rest of it is really supported by the admin data that we now use. So there is some differences in measurement here. We don't actually use social class apart from that one statistic from the new paper, which shows that the share of people from lower occupations going to Russell Group or non-Russell Group universities had increased. So there's a little bit of social class in there, but generally we used either income in the cohort studies, we used free school meals in some of the administrative data, and then we used in other elements of the administrative data, we use a slightly more refined measure, which is a combination of kind of income at the postcode level, occupation at the postcode level, free school meals, and basically any information you can get, you put in an index. So really it's only the National Child Development Study information that would affect it. I don't actually think it does, because I've done quite a lot of work on kind of looking at this, but that's always the one that people pick out. So that would kind of imply that maybe the increase in educational inequality in the 1970s and 80s was perhaps not as large, but actually all that would mean, because we know what's happening at the top of that point, it just means that it wasn't so low at the beginning, but actually it would still mean that it was really bad, because it's coming from potentially just coming from a different point at the beginning of that diagram. So yeah, I don't think that matters. I don't really think that matters very much, even if we decide that we're going to ignore that first point, which I don't think we should, but if you wanted to. In terms of COVID, there's been a huge amount of discussion about the impact of this on university finances. And of course, there's also an issue that not only have the most prestigious universities got a diverse funding structure, as you say, and a lot of money has been pushed into research, some of the best universities in response to the crisis, you've also got this issue that because of the grade inflation, it meant that the best universities are getting lots and lots more students than they would usually, if they can take them. At my university, we kind of came to the conclusion pretty early that we didn't want to do that, because there's absolutely no way we could fit them in if we want to have some face-to-face instruction with social distancing. So we'll see what the fallout of that is financially, that decision. But as I say, 700 in the first year at UCL. So it's fairly massive in some places. I suppose, how would it affect this story? I mean, it might mean that there are fewer options for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who maybe want to go to a local university, and that could potentially lead to, overall measures of educational inequality rising. So it's possible, but then of course here we're highlighting the fact that those kind of marginal students are perhaps not doing that well in the labour market anyway, because some of them are not, because there is quite a diversity in the returns you get from different degrees. It may encourage there to be more vocational options for students if there is a big kind of loss of lower level universities. But I don't think we know enough yet to know whether that's actually what's going to happen.
Thanks a lot. Especially regarding the second, because I'm still uncertain to what extent, our conclusions in terms of the dynamics of inequalities in the 70s and 80s are driven by what we measure, because we know from the class studies that the inequality has been more or less persistent, especially relative inequality in access.
I mean, it's really difficult though, because then what you're measuring is, changing in terms of its relative importance. So if you've got a big increase in the share of people coming from professional backgrounds at that time, then it's not really a relative measure. It's not really the same relative measure as you might get if you could isolate the bottom 20%. So we go for a relative measure in terms of pinning down the bottom of 20%, which is much more difficult to do if you use class.
Now that I learned how to do it, I thought I'd use the opportunity. I mean, in some ways, it's almost surprising that educational inequality hasn't risen, given that we know that income inequality over this period has risen massively, hasn't it? You could, if you think about when did it kick off in the UK again, the income inequality rise? It was early 80s, wasn't it? With the Thatcher years, so the first, has it gone up then?
Right, it did go up and then it came down.
Oh, okay. So at some point, people recognized some policies were effective in driving it down. They must have at some point recognized the devastating impact of growing income inequality on education attainment gaps. That's interesting. I saw the hump, and that it came down again. But I was thinking that that actually the coming down actually coincides with the period of rising income inequality over the 80s.
No, it's the other way.
So it's like the Beveridge curve argument, where you would expect a decline in social mobility with a rising income inequality effect, but that doesn't seem to be, at least not in terms of education outcomes, up to the point of higher education to be the case, right? And the second one, I mean, it's from my own interest more, because I've done some with Francis Green, some stuff on private schools, right? I'm pretty sure you know Francis.
Yes, yeah, I do.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the big mechanisms in UK or in England specifically, isn't it? That there's not much movement, given that you need to be really, really rich to get into these really, really elite schools that then get you into the really, really selective colleges and universities. Have you done any comparative look or analysis over time to see how this attainment gap changed by private school attendance?
I haven't. Steve Machin's done a bit.
Okay.
And I think, it comes out as you would expect that those things have grown. It's difficult in a lot of our data because the new administrative data that's coming online generally excludes private school pupils. So that's a bit of a shame, really. You can't really pick them up in some of these studies, although they do pop back up again in the higher education records. So one thing we're planning to do with this mismatch story is we actually think that school type is probably quite an important driver of mismatch. So one of the things that private schools do is they actually get their kids into the best universities, and nobody's really looked at that. So we're going to try and do that. I'm desperately trying to work out. I've got two displays now. I wanted to show you the chart again, but I can't work out how to do it. But yeah, there was definitely an increase in educational inequality for cohorts born or for cohorts growing up in the 1980s. And then it kind of leveled off once the kind of new Labour government got in and started affecting, really driving up standards in schools. And so you can see that effect in the way that you would expect, I think, that actually the biggest increases in educational inequality happened at the time when income inequality was rising.
So it's a question from Jiho Song. Hi, Joe. Are there any expected anti-poverty or public education policy changes to address the increasing stickiness between parents and children's educational achievement in the UK? If not, what directions do you think are needed to improve the intergenerational upward mobility in the UK? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think that there was a definite, real focus on improving educational standards through things like the literacy hour, so putting a really big focus on literacy and numeracy in primary school by having school competition. No one's really sure if that worked, but it certainly shone a spotlight on, school outcomes. And there was a huge drive to improve school outcomes, especially for schools in disadvantaged areas. There's a big London story about how well schools have done in London from about 2000 onwards. So there definitely has been. I think my talk illustrates something very clearly, though, that the kind of stickiness has kind of moved elsewhere, and it's really difficult to know what to do about that at the higher levels. So, the more radical commentators are suggesting that there should be some element of randomization in university access, which I think would be very difficult to implement politically, and it's quite a radical, but that's the kind of thing you would probably need to do to really make a difference, because it does seem to be that the kind of richer families are finding new and different ways to distinguish their children.
Thanks, Jo, for interesting presentation. When I was looking at your presentation, I just keep thinking that this is typical or very interesting because of the characteristics of the educational system in the UK is a EMI process, if we recall the theoretical part of your presentation, right? So advantaged students are differentiating themselves by getting postgraduates in the most prestigious university and so on. Could you, if the data or the analysis are allowed to do that, could you unpack a little bit more about what I remember as these adaptation processes in which from Alon Sigal, for the case of the US, also studied within this big EMA process as related to the rising or the increase of for example, of the grades of previous achievement, particularly in the private schools, if it's possible to observe that, could explain this kind of increasing differentiation in the higher levels of attainment. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, I think I think that's what we're seeing, really. I don't know quite how you would get into it in more depth, but I think that's what this analysis suggests, is that the kind of massification of higher education is meaning that barrier is rising, and certain groups are better able to run towards it. It's a mixed metaphor, but still.
Right, but that means that in the last years, students from, let's say, from privileged backgrounds are getting higher grades, or for example, in this entry exam. Is that related to the grade inflation that you also talk about?
It's it's a bit difficult to know if it's grade inflation or if it's genuinely better outcomes. And there's always discussion about that, but there's definitely been no closing of the gap at higher levels of compulsory education. So when you're looking at outcomes at age 16, it's always, the majority of children from well-off backgrounds who are achieving these kind of composite qualifications like the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, which makes sure that you have a broad and high level education at age 16, and you can definitely see, there's no closing of the gap at that point. So that would kind of say, speak to your hypothesis, I think.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this talk. It's very interesting, and to see that so strikingly happen at the higher educational level. Actually, I have two more comments / question. One is regarding the hierarchical system in the UK and the inequalities this produces. It would be actually interesting to see then if to what extent other countries where the higher education system is not that hierarchically structured, to what extent or how mobility would improve or evolve then in this system. So if a system where there are almost no differences across universities does better, or if there are other layers of differentiation then. So for example, I would think in Austria or in Germany, there would be a larger differentiation than between more vocational tracks of higher education and more like the universities. So that's whether this produces similar extents of differences across socioeconomic backgrounds, or less pronounced ones. That would be actually interesting. And the other question I would have, do you have any insights how children from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds do on the labor market when they were able to obtain, for example, a Russell Group degree? So do they, similarly to better off children, or is there another disadvantage coming in afterwards in the labor market?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely the first question you asked sounds like a job for the list, doesn't it? That's fantastic. I think that would be really, really interesting, and somebody should do it. But the second question, I think I mentioned this briefly, in that there is evidence that students from higher and lower socioeconomic groups do receive different returns to higher education. So you can see that there's a 20 percentage point gap in the returns for higher versus lower backgrounds. And half of that is explained by the fact that they're going to different places. So that implies that half of it isn't. Kind of that speaks to your question, in that there does be some differences between the returns that people are getting, even if they have access to the same university.
I mean, there also probably comes the gender issue in, because there are probably, or is there a similar number of women in Russell Group universities as men, and how do they do then afterwards? This is then probably related to occupational decisions and all.
Exactly. I mean, it seems like from the mismatch paper that I mentioned briefly, it seems that there is a gap between where men and women are going. And it's particularly manifested in the fact that girls go to universities which have lower earnings than the rank that you would expect them to have given their prior qualifications. Actually, it's not so much that they go to lower universities, it's they go to courses which are, so a combination of course and university, and it seems it's driven probably by subject choice, I think. So often if they do go to Russell Group universities, it's not to the subjects which are really going to give them the high returns. They may do English or history or something like that. But it's not exactly unexpected, but it's still nice to see it. I think, it that confirmed.
Thanks very much, both Jo and Petra, for your talks. Really interesting, lots of information.